Danny Haiphong joins me now. He's an author, political commentator, and contributing editor at Black Agenda Report. Danny is also the co-host of the YouTube show The Left Lens and co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, a platform that promotes understanding of Chinese socialism. Danny, thanks so much for taking the time. It's really great to have you on.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's always good to be with you.
Likewise, brother. I wanted to start out with the Beijing Winter Olympics that have just kicked off. In the news, we don't hear so much about the sports. We hear more about the games being boycotted by the United States, the United Kingdom, and co. I've heard people in the United States refer to them as the genocide games. Can I just get your thoughts in general on this whole debacle?
Well, I watched the opening ceremony February 4th. I was up early. I was watching it through NBC News streaming service, and it was just absolutely deplorable. I mean, the level of propaganda that China has been targeted with by the corporate media is astounding, and this has been going on for years, but the corporate media, the military-industrial complex, and these humanitarian interventionists in both camps, as well as the political establishment, have all coalesced around this human rights narrative to attempt to delegitimize China in this momentous occasion. I mean, it's historic that China is the first dual Olympics country. Beijing's the first dual Olympic city. Many of the facilities are being reused from the 2008 Summer Olympics. It's 100% green powered. And the COVID-19 success that China has had in containing the virus is being implemented to protect both athletes, all the participants, all of the workers, as well as the Chinese people, because this is a huge international event. And when you have a highly contagious pandemic still spreading, China has taken it very seriously, and that has become also the target of attack by the media, by the establishment. And so really, it's a full frontal assault. It's all about making China look bad in a moment where the United States and the West are having a really hard time doing that. It seems like the more and more success that China has, whether it's these Winter Olympic Games, whether it's success around COVID, success around poverty alleviation. You've been covering this, I know, success in building partnerships with countries around the world that the United States just so happens to target with starvation sanctions like Syria and Nicaragua. All of this points to, I think, what is really at the root of all of the slander around the Olympics, which is that the United States is watching and the West is watching their supremacy wane and China's legitimate rise in the eyes of the majority of humanity occur right before it. And I think that's really what's at the heart here. And the Olympics, I mean, all of what I said in terms of China's successes, but also now with this Eileen Gu situation and the slander and the attacks and the racist attacks that she has received, and the way that the corporate media has totally played into that with this chauvinistic nationalism, talking about betraying the United States because this 18-year-old dual citizen wants to ski for China instead of the United States. All of this is a part of the propaganda war. It's part of this new Cold War, and it's part of a brazen imperialist assault on our consciousness. If you just listen to just a tiny bit of the opening ceremony, you had hacks from Yale University, from Bloomberg News, talking about how authoritarian China was, how China is peddling out, Uyghur athletes and Uyghur workers in the opening ceremony in order to show that there's no genocide there. But in fact, that there is, and this is all just part of China's ruse to put the blinders over everyone's eyes.
Yeah. So I mean, you actually answered my second question, which was what is at the root of all this? Why all this propaganda? What are they trying to accomplish here? because there is a lot of prestige associated with, as you said, being the first country to host, both Olympics, the first city. So, I mean, what is the root of all this? Why all this propaganda? Why all the vitriol?
Well, I think first and foremost, the vitriol towards China is about the U.S.'s overall geopolitical strategy in the West. They're junior partners that the United States has curried favor with because of very similar common interests: imperialism, capitalism, exploitation. This is where the West and the United States, Israel, and all of the allies that the U.S. has been able to obtain, that's where they all can agree upon. And oftentimes it's not an equal relationship either. It's the U.S. attempting to bully them into really towing the line on the agenda. And the U.S. claims and desires to be a permanent hegemon, a permanent imperial power that has no rival. And so, at the most basic level, the United States views China as a legitimate rival, but it's not enough to look at it in that lens, because that can lead to this false equivalency that unfortunately some of our friends on the left make, which is that China is just some equal imperialist power, that actually it's going far beyond what the United States can do. There's a lot of this misinformation that goes around. And so it's important to understand that the United States, if China was indeed an imperialist power, a colonial power, it wouldn't really have a problem with that. It would actually probably be seeking much closer relations to China than it ever even had during the normalization period and during the so-called, entrance into the World Trade Organization. Not even that is enough to prove that China and the U.S. were some kind of similar entities. How the United States deals with its so-called allies is through organizing them and enforcing a common agenda that China has never really been a part of, because China is led by a communist party. China has 1.4 billion non-white people. It is a country that proudly espouses socialism, and it is one that really employs a different model of international relations, one that is respective of international law. I mean, that's really at the basic level how China behaves around the world. But then you add in the fact that China's economic model is not just a rival and not just set to surpass the United States in size, but it also is setting a different kind of agenda, right? It's setting an agenda of poverty alleviation, of South-South cooperation, which means that countries historically impoverished, historically colonized, that remain underdeveloped, that everyone gets out of that, that it's all about literally lifting everybody up through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. So that is what the United States is really afraid of. That's what the West is really afraid of. They are afraid that the growth of this kind of model, which is fundamentally more humane, fundamentally more people-centered, will gain traction. And in fact, it is gaining traction, given just how many countries in the last 3 to 6 months that have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, given that there's more than 120 countries signed on now, and given that most of humanity looks to China for what the United States and the West cannot provide, which is infrastructure development, economic development, non-interference in the affairs of the political systems of a given country. All of these things, which are very important to stability, is what China offers, while the United States and the West, they offer bombs, they offer drones, they offer sanctions, they offer debt in the form of stringent conditionalities with the world financial institutions. That's what the U.S. and West has to offer, and we're seeing that play out. We're seeing the differences between these two models play out, and it is easy to claim now, after COVID-19 and all of the racist attacks on China, the trade war, Donald Trump calling the COVID-19 the China virus, and then Biden basically continuing all of that with a somewhat softer tone, but just as aggressive in many ways, if not more so. It's easy to claim that this is a new Cold War based on just the United States' desire to maintain hegemony, plain and simple. But the United States has always had an agenda historically that is to ensure that any model that resists the exploitation of imperialism and colonialism and capitalism is not allowed to grow and set an example for the world. And that's why China shares such a common history right now, not just with the USSR and the Soviet Union during the First Cold War, but also in the ways in which countries like Syria, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, like Iraq, like these countries also were attacked for this very reason too, because Arab nationalism was a threat to imperialism, because Venezuela's Bolivarian model of socialism, a threat to imperialism, Nicaragua's Sandinista movement, a threat to imperialism. So that's where this common thread emerges, and China should be placed there, especially given how big China is, how important China is, and that's why China's at the top of the geopolitical agenda of the United States and the West. If Nicaragua and Venezuela shared that, Syria, they would be too. But they're really the dominoes. They're seen as the weak country. Even Russia, right? Look how Biden in these private talks, right? But it doesn't even have to go into private talks. Listen how Antony Blinken, listen how Joe Biden has talked about Russia in the past. Oh, that's a weak country, no friends. They can't even get a hold of their own natural gas. They don't know what they're doing. They talk about Russia in that way, but they can't talk about China in that way, because China doesn't have a history of being subservient to the dictates of imperialism in the same way that Russia was unfortunately put under after the fall of the Soviet Union. There is not that experience. China was never able to be the victim of shock therapy, was never able to be the victim of IMF thievery, and has not and will not be the victim of U.S. military aggression, because that would be suicide for the United States as well.
Just if we could go back to the Olympics and the myths, these lies that they're propagating. I mean, let's start out with the Uyghur genocide. The U.S. is claiming that there's a Uyghur genocide in China. Now, China opened up the Olympic Games with a Uyghur athlete, and that was met with criticism. Do you believe that that was a cynical gesture by China, or a genuine gesture? And what if the Olympics had not been opened up by a Uyghur athlete? They would probably still complain about that anyway, right?
It was a really beautiful display that China presented in the opening ceremony as well, was the passing of the national flag among representatives of the 56 ethnic groups. And they were passing the flag, and then it was taken by representatives of the national military. And, there was that. I mean, that was a scene. Like, that was incredible. And it's in response to this. I mean, we can't deny that it's a total response to the fact that the United States and the West have propagandized around this issue for years now, first with concentration camps, then with genocide. And there's no escaping it. So, of course, I think China is totally correct in responding, especially responding in this kind of way, a very professional manner, one that definitely sends a message to Western audiences that China does not adhere to that narrative. China does not believe in that narrative, and that the Chinese people don't believe in that narrative, because the cheers were very loud during that part of the ceremony. And so it's just important to understand that Uyghur genocide narrative was always dubious. I mean, we can go over the sources probably for hours and hours, from Adrian Zen's Victims of Communism Foundation all the way to the Atlantic Council, and all of the institutions and proxies for these institutions that have been rolled out, Radio Free Asia, conduit of the CIA, I mean, on and on and on. These institutions have repeated this lie over and over and over again, and just basic data, it disproves it. And so it's really an agenda. It's about targeting Xinjiang. It's about splitting China apart. It's a losing mission, and it's already lost, because China is more united than ever. And a lot of it is because of this propaganda war, because ordinary Uyghurs, anyone in China doesn't want the country to be split apart. It doesn't want separatism to be fueled. It doesn't want economic livelihoods to be threatened. So the more that China is attacked by the U.S., the more unified the country becomes. And that's just one of the, I guess, benefits of this silver linings, I guess, of the US's failed strategy.
You wrote about Eileen Gu. She's a world-class athlete, half American, half Chinese, and she announced in 2019 that she would be representing China in 2022. And you wrote in your article that, quote, Gu has been labeled an ungrateful traitor to the United States for supposedly spurning the opportunities offered to her in the land of the free. I mean, the responses on Fox where they were saying that she's switched sides and she's turned her back on the United States, the country that raised her and provided her with training and facilities that only the US has. I mean, what does that even mean? Like other countries don't have anyone who can ski? What do you think of all this?
Essentially, it is a byproduct of a long history of racism toward Chinese, but just in general, right? This racism, this imperialism that the United States has developed over the course of its development is par for the course in reproducing the exploitation that is inherent to the US way of life. And so those who cross the boundaries of what I call political whiteness, which is a tool of imperialism, this idea that you will have solidarity with the so-called enemy other, the country that has been targeted for elimination, destruction, regime change, whatever, that this is akin to renouncing your citizenship. That's what Tucker Carlson called it. That's what many people are saying, when in fact, Eileen Gu, if you just listen to her words, it's pretty clear. Listen to her words and understand who she is. It's pretty clear that her relationship to China is very deep. It's not that she is doing this for political reasons. She's doing this because, one, she's a citizen of China. Two, her mother is very deeply involved in China's economy. She goes to China nearly every summer before the pandemic, and she has many Chinese sponsors. She's well known in China, and she's making it very clear the more and more pressers she does, because the question is asked over and over again, why'd you do this? Why'd you choose that? What do you think of what people are saying? She was very clear recently after she won her first gold medal that she's receiving love. And I don't think people understand that there's a good reason why she chose China over the United States. And I think we're seeing that play out. She is Chinese and she loves China. She loves the Chinese people and she has affinity towards them. They have affinity towards her. She broke the internet after she won the gold medal in China. Weibo shut down because of how many people were sharing and celebrating her victory. And so that's the kind of love she receives. You follow her Instagram, you see every post she's being mobbed by people, and she's sharing all of the heartfelt messages she's getting from people. And the United States is trying to politicize that because they see it as a smack in the face. The ruling class sees a smack in the face. And a lot of people who have digested this anti-China racism and resentment, they see it as a slap in the face. They see it as an attack on the US itself, on American exceptionalism itself, because it really validates to them the state of affairs, I think, that we have talked about earlier in this interview. It validates the fact that China could be seen as worthy of love and not scorn, of identification and not backlash. And I think that's really at issue here, is that it's not only that China is supposed to be the quote unquote sick man of Asia, it's supposed to be in a state of humiliation all of the time. That's a long, more than a century old dynamic of the United States and the West during the Opium Wars and really subjugating China during that period, the mid-19th century. But then after the Chinese Revolution, the dynamic changed, and it was all about China is now supposed to be the communist evil, the authoritarian dictatorship. It is not supposed to have any qualities that are redeemable in the eyes of this civilizational mission that the United States and the West is on in terms of its great capacity for democracy and freedom. And we're seeing Eileen Gu just say, no, I'm Chinese and I am proud to ski for Team China. And I am also a principled person in trying to figure out as an 18-year-old girl what my morals and values are. And that is just, for someone who's so connected, for someone who has such a platform, I mean, there is no graver public relations crime, I think, that Eileen Gu could have committed. And that's not any fault of her own. That is completely a byproduct of the situation we're in. It's a byproduct of the fact that this so-called competition that the United States and the West are waging with China is really just war. It's really a propaganda war. It's an economic war. It's a military war. It's a diplomatic war. And now we're seeing that play out with Eileen Gu, and she's caught in the middle. While the media claims, like The Economist, they claim no, she's caught in the middle of the U.S. and China just competing with each other, and she chose China. No, Eileen Gu is actually caught in the middle of a U.S.-led war on China and on a rising Asia and on a rising multipolar world order, in which Eileen Gu's example is pathetically really a threat, right? That shouldn't be a threat. This is just an 18-year-old woman who is playing for a Chinese, she's a Chinese citizen and she's playing for China. It should stop at that, but because the United States has a political agenda and its political agenda is really not working, right? The agenda is not being met. The US is on the decline. And so every little thing that the US perceives and the West perceives as being a slight on imperialism, on the United States, on its exceptionalism, is blown into these proportions, because I guess there are some people who think that this is going to work, but really what it does is, again, it unites the Chinese people. It also creates a dynamic where the United States and the West are exposed as backwards, as like completely backwards. And more people around the world who may have accepted, okay, yeah, China is this and that, they may look at this and say, well, around the world, especially outside of the US's colonial borders, they say, well, this is a little much. Olympics are kind of an important thing. They're kind of important money-wise, internationally, finance, just there's a lot of important things that go into the Olympics, and something like this, which tarnishes its reputation, is just, it only will serve to isolate the United States even further.
Yeah, it's frankly quite incredible. I know Fox News likes to paint itself as sort of anti-war, but it's really just fueling, this resentment, which, I mean, what good does that do anyone? I think it's very embarrassing, as you just put it. It's really, really telling on yourself by doing that. But I mean, what does this kind of reaction to Eileen Gu tell you about this anti-Chinese racism? Because there's this whole hashtag that we saw, like, stop hate against Chinese, but yet there's always antagonism towards China. Like, that doesn't stop, And we've also heard these other myths that, oh, careful going to the Olympics because the Chinese are spying on the athletes, like, as if the NSA hasn't been bugging everyone's phone on the planet. And then, of course, they were also saying how Peng Shuai, this tennis player, had gone missing. Can you clue us in on all of this?
Well, it's more propaganda, and it's just been an onslaught, right? I mean, Peng Shuai, she was unfortunately exploited by the media, the Western media, for a post that she made about a former Chinese official, former vice premier, Jiang Guoli, who supposedly was accused of sexual assault, but really it sounded like a complex situation, and certainly there may be things to investigate there. But the problem with it is that it was mistranslated, it was taken into account, and then there was a rumor that she was missing altogether, and that China had somehow detained her or disappeared her, and all of that wasn't true, right? Within a day of that accusation, photos of her on WeChat, video of her at a Beijing, teenage skating competition, like they started to emerge, and the agenda is pretty clear here. And she's come up in the Olympics as well, right? Eileen Gu was asked a question about Peng Shuai, and Eileen Gu was like, I'm happy that she's here and that she's safe, and that's all she said, because she didn't want to get into the politics of it, because there's a lot of politics in this. The United States, if you just look at the corporate media coverage, it's not just Peng Shuai, it's everything. I mean, the COVID-19 protocol, for example, has been blasted, right? This dynamic zero COVID strategy that China has, which has been wildly successful. Now, people from the West, these hack journalists are there, and they can't stop complaining about it. They post on Twitter, the food is poor, right? They post on Twitter, right? There was someone from Reuters who published this thread about how it was just so dystopic to see a bartender in a hazmat suit, right? Like these just obvious examples of innuendo to try to scare people, to try to demonize China's COVID-19 response, to make China look like it's so big bad when really it's just China's just trying to protect workers who are dying all across the world because they have to work and they're being forced to work and they're dying of COVID-19 in the thousands in the United States. Uh, China is doing its best to feed a very spoiled Western population that thinks it deserves the best all of the time. Like these are just not even problems, but they're made into problems because there is this desperation on the part of the US, especially its media apparatus. The media apparatus has an agenda around the Olympics, which is very simple. It's to continuously discredit the games so that China looks bad and also bring in geopolitics at every instance, right? During the whole opening ceremony, you probably heard Vladimir Putin was there. So were 30 other officials from countries around the world, including a handful of countries from Central Asia and Kazakhstan being one of them, right? The US definitely behind trying to engineer a coup there. And here you have Central Asian countries, like, we're not getting involved in that diplomatic boycott going to Beijing and watching the Olympic Games. I mean, this is the state of affairs. And so, yeah, the United States media, the corporate media feels compelled to wage. And I wouldn't be surprised if the State Department is in on this because you had during the lead up to the games, not only dozens of US officials State Department officials apply for visas despite the diplomatic boycott, but you also had some embassy activity where there were several employees who left Beijing and they tried to say that it was because of COVID-19 issues, when really it was most likely an attempt to show that China is dangerous right now. And that's been the theme, right? It's the theme across the board is China is dangerous. Peng Shuai is in danger. You're in danger of the COVID-19 protocol. Look at how your freedoms are being taken away. Look at Putin is there and Putin's about to invade Ukraine supposedly. And right, you had this Bloomberg News hack, I can't even remember his name, who uh, was one of the pundits for the opening ceremony, say the world will change dramatically if Putin and Russia invade Ukraine and then China supports Russia in that effort. Like basically insinuating that they're going to start World War III, right? I mean, that's how irresponsible this is when you have the United States literally using NATO to militarize that region and actually bring the world to the precipice of World War III. They're trying to say that China and Russia's partnership around a mythical, completely made up insinuation that Russia is going to invade Ukraine is somehow going to spark World War III. I mean, that's how bad it is getting, but it's all part of this sort of sour grapes. We are losing control over the narrative because we're losing control over the international situation, the world situation. We're losing control of our legitimacy. It just doesn't exist anymore.
It's absolutely disgusting. I mean, it infuriates me, and I gather you feel the same. It's absolutely infuriating how their coverage is dystopian. That's what's really dystopian, and just it's like they're throwing the toys at the pram. It's really throwing a tantrum, as you just said, because they are losing legitimacy and losing control of the narrative. It's really pathetic. But I want to ask you, Danny, how much does the boycott actually hurt China? Because at the same time, several countries came to the opening ceremony, as you just mentioned, and several countries have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. So Syria, Argentina, Cuba, just to name a few. And the list is much, much, much longer than that. So, I mean, what does that say about how China is perceived what does that say about how China is perceived in the West and by the rest of the world?
Diplomatic boycott only hurts China in the sense that it fuels anti-China resentment in the places where this new Cold War is being waged from. So the US, the UK, several European countries. That's the only place where it hurts China, so to speak, in the sense that, yeah, the anti-China resentment continues, it continues to grow, but that's the case with any policy. That's just realpolitik at this point. So in the concrete sense, the diplomatic boycott is more of a paper tiger. It doesn't really have any impact. It's questionable whether U.S. officials would have been invited anyway to the event, COVID-19 protocols and the souring relationship notwithstanding. It's unclear whether that was really in the cards. But in terms of perceptions, I mean, I think what we're seeing is that China's prestige around the world is actually very high. That not only do the Chinese people support the government in the 90 percentile range, but you also have a growing number of countries, basically the vast majority of countries, who see China's relationship as so valuable that they're not willing to risk any kind of geopolitical games around that relationship. So even countries that are so tied to the United States, even a country like Israel is not willing to give up bilateral economic ties because that's suicide, right? China is the only place where things like solar power, for example, is produced on a mass scale, right? It's one of the few countries where that actually is happening, where infrastructure for rail and highways and that sort of thing is being done at a level of high value. And for countries that are so poor, like a Nicaragua, like a Cuba, to spurn that relationship for any reason, even if the US were tomorrow to say, we'll lift sanctions, it's just not in the cards, right? Because the United States is not a reliable partner. And the world is understanding this more and more so, right? It wasn't just the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's been all of these dirty wars, all of these proxy wars that have happened since then, all of the destabilization. Look at what's happened to Syria and the rest of the region in, really the cradle of civilization. It's a disaster, and it's all US facilitated. And it's facilitated in the most heinous and disgusting ways. It's not just we're dropping bombs on you very clearly. It's we're going to arm groups, we're going to arm reactionary forces, and we are going to slaughter children. The US just conducted a so-called night raid where they killed several children, right? I mean, this is the real character of the United States. And this is not also to factor in that the US economy is shrinking. So objectively, the United States actually just does not have anything to offer. So even if countries that are under the boot of the United States wanted to just be under the boot of the United States, they're likely not going to get everything that they need, right? Because you have a contracting US economy. Even when it grows, it hasn't recovered since 2007, 2008. It's bilateral economic ties in a lot of these resource-rich regions like Latin America, like Africa, have not increased to any significant degree. So what are these countries to do? Are they to wait to be further militarized? I mean, that's already happening, right? The destabilization of these parts of the world is already happening. The US is spreading its military apparatus everywhere because that's where all of the investment is going. But that's not going to help legitimize even the most so-called corrupt governments around. It's not going to legitimize any government to rely on a partner like that, no matter what character your government is. How can you rely on the United States if it's not going to even give a semblance of assistance that's legitimate, that's concrete, and that's beneficial for society as a whole? This is truly a watershed moment. I think it's one of the positive things about this moment. We hear a lot about the negatives. We hear a lot about how destructive everything is and how COVID-19 and all of the US's endless wars, how they've paved this path of destruction. But we don't often hear about how there is a way. People are trying to find a way, and it's not all darkness. There's actually a lot of potential here to do something that wasn't done during the first Cold War. You had a lot of promise. The World Socialist Movement, right, laid this foundation that was incredible for colonized people, for oppressed people all over the world, for working people all over the world. But what wasn't done then was a country that had once been super exploited and impoverished moving into an advanced economic stage. That's never happened. The Soviet Union was able to grow incredibly and deserves all sorts of credit for being able to come out of World War II and become the second largest economy in the world. But even the Soviet Union's economy was not as strong as China's is right now. And it was not in a position to do what China's doing right now. The Belt and Road Initiative was not in the cards for the Soviet Union during the First Cold War for many different reasons. And so it's very exciting, I think, to see that Asia, Latin America, Africa, there's a possibility of real unity and a possibility, it's already happening, standards of living are rising in countries that are participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. That's just a fact. The World Bank even says it, that there will be millions of jobs created, millions of people lifted out of extreme poverty. And it's actually that fact that will increase people's expectations and perhaps lead to even more exciting, transformative movements, transformative, um, you know, uh, situations and developments that can really place the world in a better place than it is right now, being led by the US's destructive unipolar imperialist agenda.
Yeah, I share your optimism. We gotta have hope. We gotta have something good to look forward to, and it really shows a lot of promise. Danny, I just want to jump over to an unrelated topic. That picture that you shared on Twitter about this police funeral in New York. These waves and waves of police. Both you and Susan Sarandon, you caught a lot of flack because of that. Uh, you said that this is what fascism is. This is fascism in America. I mean, tell me your thoughts on the whole issue, the picture, the reaction.
I expected that tweet to do pretty well because that picture was going viral and it speaks for itself. And exactly, it was one of those moments where you had hundreds of thousands. It seemed like, I don't even know how many thousands were there, but they were packing lower Manhattan with so-called off-duty officers. And the image was just eerie, right? It was these militarized cops mourning their so-called fallen soldier when they're committing 1,000 murders per year, the overall U.S. police departments. But the NYPD has a very sordid record with the racist stop and frisks, their own issues with uh, excessive force and homicide and racial profiling and the like. And so, yeah, I tweeted about it. I said, I'll tell my kids this is what fascism looks like. And then Susan Sarandon happened to, I didn't even know this until it started getting media coverage, that she had did something on Instagram or something, had taken my tweet, shared it in some kind of story, and then, gave her own take on it. Why I think she said something to the effect of, well, if they can all be doing this now, then I guess we don't really need them to be protecting us any day if they all have the time and ability to take the time off now to all be together at the same time. And so the media picked this up because the PBA, the police union, the reactionaries, the thin blue line folks, they came out infuriated over this and they attacked her, called her a B-list actress. She received extremely negative responses, and it created a situation where I think it was less than 24 hours, 48 hours later, she apologized for the wrong. It was a very legal apology published on her Twitter. Obviously, it was focus grouped with attorneys. It was very obvious that had happened. And to me, I mean, it was unfortunate because it had gotten so much press coverage, and I think it's an opportunity to really forward a real message about the role of the police, and to cower to the police departments only reinforces the message that their power is unmatched and not capable of being challenged. And it doesn't do service to the fact that the police have such a profound amount of political power in the United States. The fact that she was forced to apologize demonstrates that in one case, but in many cases, a lot of these so-called reforms that are just not happening in the United States around policing are not happening because the police unions don't want them to happen and the police departments don't want them to happen. and that they can actually end political careers. They can influence city, state, and federal legislatures to do what they want. There's a reason why US police departments receive billions in US military weaponry per year. It's not just because the Pentagon wants to do it, it's also because the police departments want it as well, and they can use their political influence to ensure that it happens. So, they can ensure that Congress persons are not elected again. They can ensure that governors are not elected again. They can ensure judges are not elected again, are not able to serve. They have basically not full control, but they have extreme influence over all levels of the state. And so to me, it was a very simple message. There wasn't any, to me, it was just something I would say all the time. I was intimidated, the responses, it's just like, that's the shit you hear everywhere. Yeah, you hear that everywhere. The thin blue line folks, thin blue line, they're racist, they're sexist, they're transphobic, they're all the things, they're imperialist. They're just utter and total reactionaries. And, it's one of those things where you can't give an inch to this kind of reaction, because at the end of the day, that funeral was not about the officer who was killed. Because first of all, police, it's not a very dangerous job. The police is not that doesn't happen very frequently. But the police politicize everything, and they were really exploiting this murder to basically have a show of force around the new mayorship, right? That's all about showing force with Eric Adams, who is their guy. He's a former NYPD. He's former NYPD, and he has already said that he's going to do anything he can to turn back the clock all the way before Bloomberg, right? This guy is really looking to serve the NYPD to the highest extent possible. And so this is what this is all about. Eric Adams won't get the de Blasio treatment. De Blasio did nothing to the NYPD that was worthy of treatment that he got from the NYPD, but they still turn their backs on him. They'll never turn their backs on Eric Adams, because Eric Adams let them do something like this, which is to show everyone that this is how numerous the police are. This is how unified the police. This is the Blue Brotherhood. And watch out if you do something like this. You accidentally kill an officer because there was a hectic situation, a response to something. Well, we'll show you that we can kill you many more times. And that's what the police departments that's what the NYPD was saying. That's what they were saying to everybody. And they were blocking emergency vehicles and showing up en masse during a pandemic without masks, like always, right? That's a running joke in New York and all over the country. It's the police do not follow pandemic protocols. They never have, they never will. And it's because it's another way to show that they are the law, right? That's the police in the United States. They're the law. They're not above the law. They believe themselves to be the law in the same way that the US believes itself to be international law. What the US says go, what the police says goes, and it's all about protecting and serving capital and employing and enforcing the repression necessary to do that.
You got that right, brother. Danny, where can people find your work? Where can they follow you online?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me usually weekly at blackagendareport.com. You can follow my Substack, chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com. You can subscribe there for free. If you want to do a paid subscription, please, that would be great. You can follow me on Twitter at Spirit of HO, Spirit of Ho. And you can find all of my work, my articles, my streams at the Left Lens YouTube channel at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong, where you can give a monthly donation of whatever amount you're able. And I appreciate you having me, Richard. This was great.
Make sure you guys follow Danny and support his work. He's an excellent, exceptional journalist. Danny Haiphong, thank you so much for coming on the program, brother. It's so good and refreshing to speak to you.
Yeah, it's really good to speak to you. I love your work, and yeah, more coordination in the future for sure.
All right. Take care, bro. Have a good one. Bye-bye.